Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape 353. It's September the 8th, 1978. The House Select Committee on Assassinations is having their public hearing on television. They had James Earl Ray last week, and we discussed that. And they're having their hearings on the John Kennedy assassination. They begin out here in California at 6 in the morning, and I have gotten up 2 mornings. I'll be getting up for every hearing, of course. And the format is that I'm typing up the hearings each day. Yesterday I typed up 90 pages of the testimony of John Connally and Robert Groden, and then I transcribed them into a brief summary of my opinions of that particular day's testimony, the pertinent points, the points left out, the best I could. And I guess I'll keep that format going each day so that I don't get behind. And I typed up the testimony the following day of Dr. Cyril Wecht and the medical testimony on the John Kennedy autopsy and the discrepancies in the Warren Commission report and the autopsy report and the new information that's being put out at this time. There are a lot of questions that you will probably have. Many people that take these tapes are old researchers. They have a lot of material. They know a lot of facts, and they want new information or my opinions on certain areas specifically. And there are many people that have started subscribing to tapes recently that are not familiar with many years of past work or the 15 years research. And it's very hard to find a compromise here between going into this material at a too fast a point or level and yet informing those people that are not familiar with all the backlog. The only way I can see to do that is to just briefly cover the material that I think is pertinent. And I can't begin to cover it all. I mean, we could do tapes the rest of the year on just what I heard today, I think, or yesterday. But the main thing is that if you have any questions that I don't cover in this material now or on any other tape or any other subject, write to me and I'll do cassettes for you so that we can all share it and update some information. Or you can pick up a telephone and call me. I can't answer letters. I'm just deluged with mail to answer specific points of the research, and that's really difficult and time-consuming. So you can pick up a phone. My number is here on the paper that's enclosed with your tapes. If you have a question to ask, and if you want me to go at length on a subject, just let me know, and if I haven't covered it, I will. The crux of the investigation was put very well by Dr. Cyril Wecht when he testified, it was September the 7th, 1978, on the single bullet theory. Robert Blakey, who I've accused of covering up right from the very beginning, hired a group of 9 doctors, forensic pathologists, to give testimony on the bullet direction and the bullet 399 to lean heavily on what is known to the various researchers as a single bullet theory. And they asked Dr. Cyril Wecht, who's both a lawyer and a doctor and a very active, very, very active person continuously in exposing corruption at the highest levels, they asked him to testify before this committee. He testified before the Rockefeller Committee several years ago, and I understand that when they printed their report, they published something different than what he testified. And when he asked for the original report, he couldn't see the original testimony and compare how it was changed. Dr. Cyril Wecht was asked to testify on ballistic trajectory and the autopsy reports because he is a prominent man, but they stacked up these various people against him and let one gentleman, one doctor from New York City, be the spokesman for all the other people, and he would be the person that, by weight of sheer numbers of people against Dr. Cyril Wecht, hopefully Mr. Blakey, Robert Blakey, hoped that they would soften what Cyril Wecht had to say, and Dr. Bolden was the man speaking for all the other pathologists. But as he wound up his testimony and argued continuously about what is known as a single bullet theory, it's the thing which the Warren Commission clung to. It was created by Arlene Specter. It has no ability to hold up in terms of trajectory or evidence, physical evidence. It's something that people cling to because they have to hold on to the lone assassin story. When you get into 2 or more gunmen, you have a conspiracy. And Dr. Cyril Wecht was very moving and very dramatic, and these tapes are available at the Tape Center here in Pacific Grove. You can write to me, and I'll include the address here. You can get any or all of these tapes. And I think in terms of research, you should at least get the tape of Dr. Cyril Wecht, the last hour that he testified or so before he completed his testimony, because he got very angry when they tried to nail him with being outnumbered by the other people, and he gave logical reasons why he thought his testimony would hold up. And he made an important point that when assassination happens in the future, whether it's a president or a congressman or a judge, a federal government a figure, that the medical examination and the legal investigation should be done in a way that is proper, that any ordinary citizen gets, that the average person gets. And the physical evidence shouldn't be destroyed. And if we had a clear record of physical evidence in these assassinations, and if we also had prosecution for people who destroy evidence in criminal matters, it would be harder to do these conspiracies because there would be less chance of people knowing that they can get away with it. And he asked that the record show for all times that there is a way to conduct autopsies and legal investigations. He also said that there's a mental block, an impediment. And he said he recognizes this. It's a political nature. It prevents individuals from letting it all come out. He as much as said there is a conspiracy. If you want to see it, it's all there. And they asked him how come he sees it and the other men don't, and he said, because I'm more open. He attacked the way that the autopsy was done years ago. We have all objected to that. We researchers, some of us started 15 years ago when we read the Warren Commission exhibits and testimony, and only this week they changed the bullets. The fatal headshot from John Kennedy is now officially 4 inches higher than it was before. These people worked with a photograph, and Commander Hume worked with the actual body. So there shouldn't be a discrepancy of more than a half an inch. Even though Commander Hume didn't have photographs, he had the corpse on the table. And yet there's a 4-inch difference and a lot of bungling, and he wasn't cross-examined on any of this. But Dr. Cyril Wecht said the reason he sees it differently, that he lets it come out. And I could identify with that. The reason I think I see history differently and could see it changing and see the lies and corruption all along is that I'm not afraid of truth, and I'm not afraid of some people being hurt, because for all of those that get hurt and caught, there's others that will be saved in the future. And I don't think it's negative to look for conspiracies. I think it's positive, and I identify with a life force of wanting to do a thorough job so it doesn't happen again, and so that people don't get away with these things and are allowed free on the streets to do other assassinations and murders. He said that if they show up, the single bullet theory, if they would give it up, it has no basis ballistically, trajectory-wise, it witnesses photographic evidence. There isn't anything to support the fact that one bullet came out of Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle and went into the back of John Kennedy and out the throat and into the back of John Connally and through his chest and broke ribs and into his lungs and into his hand and shattered the wrist, and then went into his thigh and fell out whole and pristine on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. And he said when you give that up, when you give up that, then you get into an area of criminal conspiracy. And the reason people are holding on to the single bullet theory and they can't go into 2 or more is you have a criminal conspiracy. And he said this recognition is hard for people to see. Cyril Wecht went on and said the president is gone. We can't bring him back. But we have political assassinations all over the world. He said there was a coup d'etat. We consider them in, he named the countries of Europe and Asia, the Banana Republics, Africa, Orient, everywhere, but not the USA. And he went on to say it did happen here. And he said, I don't know who it was or how it happened, but there was this coup d'etat, and that people are afraid to face it. And as long as they hold on to the single bullet theory, they'll never solve the assassination. It was a very dramatic moment, and I was excited because he did talk about people's fears of holding on, of political interests, vested political interests. He said that several of the doctors that opposed his views, one worked for CBS, one worked for the Rockefeller Committee, that they had political reasons for bowing under and tantamount to being not blackmailed, but just playing the game, politically, medically playing the game. and they asked him several times, "Is this what you mean?" And he said yes. And I was really excited. There's very few heroes in this whole game of research. There's a lot of really good people that I know that I could name who never would be allowed to testify before the committee any more than they would let me testify there. So they, even with their careful screening job of making sure that you went through these layers of people and were screened, Cyril Wecht got through, said what he had to say, and the record will be printed, and you can buy it from the government printing office, and you can buy the tapes and be proud that after 15 years somebody can speak up and tell it like it is decently. And he made a lot of points, and I was really very happy to identify with him and with my work that I've done against tremendous odds. We've done it against tremendous odds, but the truth will come out, and in spite of Blakey's covering up and the way the committee is set up, it will make a mark, and there will be more investigations because it's just going to open new areas of bungling that these people have done even while they spent their $5 million. The committee hearings are running about 7 hours a day continuously with very little break, and my sending you a tape just once a week won't cover many, many hours of work. So, as I say, I have to condense my summary of some of this. But the first hearings on the John Kennedy assassination began with John Connally and Mrs. Connally, and of course they give a lot of credence to what they're saying, particularly when they say that Lee Harvey Oswald, they believe all the shots came from the direction of Lee Harvey Oswald, that they came behind us. John Connally said there was no other direction. It had to be from behind him. He heard 2 shots. His wife heard 3 shots, but it isn't important for their sake. They just simply stated flatly that it came from behind them. They never mentioned silencers. I have a book here on silencers built for the CIA. They were made for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Gary Powers had a gun with a silencer when he was brought down over the Soviet Union. Mr. Werbel, who made them for the anti-Castro Cubans, and the White House plumbers built silencers. And the consideration that these bullets could come, be more of them, a flurry of bullets, like Mr. Kellerman said in the Secret Service, never comes up at all. And the fact that many bullets, shells could be on the grass that were picked up later, or in the seat of the car, or in the body of the car, this is never brought up. They simply stick with the recall of John and Nellie Connally that there were 2 or 3 shots. Of course, there was a man named Mr. Teague who was shot. A bullet went to the curb and ricocheted and hurt him, and his cheek was bleeding. So Mrs. Connally is right that 1 shot killed John Kennedy, shot John Kennedy's back and throat, and another shot went through John Connally, and then the fatal headshot to John Kennedy. Then there is the bullet that hit Mr. Teague, and that's 4 bullets, and that makes a conspiracy right there. If you accept Nellie Connally's testimony, she's putting a conspiracy right on their lap, and then they have to write a report to get around that. The Connallys were interesting. There were comments by the committee. There were 3 main issues which the committee stated. Mr. Stokes was running the panel. They have the mandate to find out who killed John Kennedy. Did federal agencies perform adequately before or after? And did the assassin or assassins have assistance? Now, they're not going to answer any 3 of these questions because of the way they're made up. That's their mandate, but they will skirt around them and cover. And as I say, we'll have another 15 or 20-year bout before we get another committee. They began their hearings by relying, like the Warren report did, on how thorough they were. This time they had 40 investigators, 564 points of interest, 1,897 days of travel, 75 witnesses in executive session. It looks puny compared to the Warren report. The Warren report statistics were massive. But the main thing is that the Warren report was never ever duplicated. It was supposed to be the most thorough investigation that was ever done by the federal government. And yet a day after the hearings opened, we heard Commander Hume, who did the autopsy on John Kennedy, say how physically exhausted he was, and he was tired, and his first autopsy report had blood all over it, so he had to destroy it. And he didn't have photographs to work with like this committee has, and if he did, he'd see that the entry bullet wound was 4 inches above where he gave the autopsy. Commander Hume didn't have photographs. They were available, and all they had to do was develop them. They could have been developed instantly, and there were autopsy x-rays that could have been developed instead of waiting 2 or 3 years to get at those. to see if there were bullet fragments when he wrote his report, but also he had the body there. And what he wrote in his report of the body entry bullet was 4 inches different than this report, which is kind of interesting. So the statistics don't mean anything. If you're going to fumble the information, you could have 3,000 investigators and spend $72 million and still not come up with the right report. The commentator on the radio KQED was always making little digs. He always assumes that Lee Harvey Oswald was the person who shot the rifle, and there were little remarks always such as every avenue is being pursued. This was one of the quotations. And another cover-up for the Warren report was that information will come out that the Warren report didn't have access to because of scientific techniques in 1964. That may be true that there are a few they didn't have, but the Warren report was corrupt. As I said on KGO this week, about the week before it was ever put together, it was corrupted. There's another statement that was on the air. If all the information were made available that the FBI and the CIA have, then the entire truth would be known. That's a lie. It can't all be available because much of it must be destroyed. Richard Helms destroyed presidential papers. President Nixon told him not to destroy records of mind control program, and he destroyed them the day before he became ambassador to Iran. So why would you think that they would keep this information? The brains of John Kennedy have been destroyed. They're nowhere around, and Cyril Wecht had been looking for them as a pathologist. So we can't decide that truth lies with documents that the CIA or FBI have somewhere in the archives. I think we could get the truth if we all sat down and combined our research now. The answers would be very easy to put together. Another thing you hear on the news media in the break on KQED is that some people will never be satisfied. They will see conspiracies in anything. That isn't true. If we got the documentation and evidence that is required to come to a conclusion, then we'd be satisfied. They also said on television, Paul Hawk, where they're saying that they had to eliminate the crazies because they come in all shapes and sizes. He was referring to people like Penn Jones, Bob Cutler, myself, Sherman Skolnick, and many of the researchers. I can mention many of them that never were allowed to even get a letter to the commission and the committee back there. And they think that by calling people irresponsible and screening them out, that they have a sanitized, absolutely accurate investigation. Yet when they keep all the crazies away and they manage to keep all of us from ever getting near the committee, they're still shown as not running the proper ballistic tests, as padding the evidence, not calling the right witnesses on the stand, and certainly not asking the right questions when the witnesses are there. One of the big problems is that the committee will blame some dead people for the report. Probably they'll say, inasmuch as we never know. One of them is Mr. Miltier. His name came up because he had made a tape recording 2 weeks before John Kennedy was killed, that John Kennedy would be killed in Miami, and that an assassin would use a gun that was put together, could be put together in the building, a high-powered scope, and that there would be a patsy to take the blame. Mr. Miltier is dead, but the Warren Commission had that tape recording, and he was alive at the time. And also there's a Mr. Crisman who was shown, his picture was shown on the screen, and he was one of the men with the well-known Tramps picture. Crisman was an important far-right winger. He's from the Seattle area and was leading these tramps away from Dealey Plaza. They weren't arrested or fingerprinted. And Crisman is dead. And instead of going after people like Carlos Marcello or Eugene Brading, organized crime figures that I'm sure Robert Blakey knows very well through his contacts with Mo Dalitz, if there is to be any blame at all, they can say, well, Alan Dulles is dead, and Earl Warren is dead, and Lee Harvey Oswald, of course, and Jack Ruby, and 129 or 30 other people. So there's some things we'll never know. But they could get people like Carlos Marcello and see his relationship to David Ferry and Eugene Brading. Congressman Stokes began the hearings in his holier-than-thou, nauseating voice, saying, "Our mandate requires us to examine all the facts and circumstances surrounding the assassination." Now, it'd be more reasonable if he said, hey, look, folks, this is a thing that's going on for 15 years. There's 150 books on the subject. There are categories that are so long and broad that we will never be able to go into them, such as the killing of Officer Tippit or the Oswald doubles, or Jack Ruby killing Lee Harvey Oswald, or the shooting of General Walker. To say we are going to examine all the facts and circumstances is to make you think that they're doing just that, but it's it's physically impossible to do that. And Mr. Stokes is sort of a black Adolf Hitler standing there and telling you a big lie, and a big lie you might accept. He said, we will evaluate all the evidence, we're willing to listen to all the facts and circumstances, and we'll examine the material, and we will listen to reasonable persons. Now, the reasonable is the catchphrase. You see, if there's a lock on the door and Sherman Skolnick can't talk about the assassination plans to kill John Kennedy in Chicago, just a week before the assassination plans to kill John Kennedy in Miami, and 3 weeks before Kennedy was killed in Dallas, we're in a really bad way. See, Skolnick has the information about the Chicago plans, but he isn't considered reasonable. Mark Lane had made a speech that Mae Brussell and Penn Jones and Sherman Skolnick would never get before the committee, and I've mentioned that before on the tapes. So reasonable is the key word. It's used twice. Once they said this committee came into existence because of critics, writers, and researchers acting reasonably. This is Robert Blakey. To act irresponsibly is to mention Nazis and George DeMohrenschildt, or Martin Bormann, or the allegations of the links of Richard Nixon's office to the extreme right wing that could be involved in the assassination, and the German military men that came from Munich, Germany, to General Walker's friends in the Southwest, Robert Morris. That is irresponsibility, to make those connections. So what they were saying on the televisions, we'll listen to reasonable persons, and there were many reasonable persons they still didn't listen to. Jeremiah Leary was one of the men on KQED. He's one of the moderators that stays on there and talks before and after and during the show, during the break. Jeremiah Leary has constantly put down any research on the assassinations and never seen a conspiracy. He works for the Washington Star that was recently bought by the New York Times. The New York Times published the first Warren report. And we have to watch Jeremiah Leary say, this is the trial that Lee Harvey Oswald never received. And then the commission gets together. I keep calling the commission, the committee gets together and says, keep in mind, this is not a trial. There's no cross-examination. There's no defendant. There's no prosecution. We just are examining the facts. But these words are like spot mind-washing or brainwashing. In other words, what I'm saying to you, I have typed up from the hearings the first day, and I'm repeating some of the stuff that comes over the air that must stay in your mind like a Camel soup ad. Every avenue is pursued. The Warren Commission didn't have this information. We can't know until the FBI and the CIA declassify material. People would never be satisfied. The crazies had to be eliminated, and so forth. And then we will listen to reasonable people. And then Jeremiah Leary says, this is the trial that Lee Harvey Oswald never received, which again is another lie. Idi Amin compares himself to Adolf Hitler. He loves Hitler, and I think Mr. Stokes and Fontre must be our American Adolf Hitler. So when I watch them up there on the rostrum, interesting enough, the hearings, it's a little nauseating, begin by saying this is KQED and this program is given to you under the auspices of the Ford Foundation. And then I shudder because I think of when they talk about the Ford Foundation, I wonder why the Fords just don't give enough money for some of the basic tests we need in this case, instead of sanitizing a committee and putting for the American people once and for all these doubts are supposed to be tucked into security blankets and your doubts put to rest. So they're not asking for donations on KQED. It's a listener-sponsored station here. They did that during the Senate Select Committee. They asked people to send in money. But this time we don't have to spend money. We just sit back and the Ford Foundation does it. Now the Ford Foundation, the Ford Motor Company, has the car that John Kennedy was riding in when he was killed. I mentioned before that I was told by a source who was familiar with the Secret Service, who cooked for the presidents and their wives, and was familiar, used to exchange champagne with the Secret Service for information. And he told me that an agent told him that in the metal part of the car, under the upholstery, where bullets had gone through, that they would find evidence of that flurry of bullets that Mr. Kellerman talked about. Again, it would have to be with silencers. And that could explain one of the bullets in the wrist of John Connally, or a second headshot from the front that Cyril Wecht talked about in John Kennedy's case. The Ford Motor Company has this car. Within 48 hours after the time John Kennedy was killed, it was taken to Dearborn, Michigan, and Cincinnati, I believe, and the interior was ripped out, and it was used until recently by the presidents. But because Mr. Kellerman talked about a flurry of bullets, and he sat in the front seat of the car and said he knows ballistics very well, and they never considered silencers used by the CIA or the Bay of Pigs operation, and they never took pictures of the car interior before it was rebuilt, it would be nice and impossible that this particular committee would just take that car and bring it down to Washington and strip everything out and see if there were any markings on it. Now, that isn't so far out when you consider that John Connally's clothing was destroyed by dry cleaning, so we couldn't see if there were entry bullets. The street sign that was in Abraham Zapruder's film, the famous one where John Kennedy just crosses through that sign and he's clutching his throat, that sign was removed the day of the assassination and has never been seen since. And it's not like John Kennedy's brains where somebody asked to see the brains. I don't think anybody has asked or ever seen the road sign, and it could have bullet nicks in it from a silencer. The lamppost also was removed from in front of the Texas School Book Depository, which is a pretty funny thing to do right after the assassination. And these things would indicate that maybe there was even just one extra bullet out by a silencer that did one of these shots and fell or nicked this sign on the way in. The reason I think Ford is important, and I mentioned it once before, was that at the time that Lee Oswald was at work in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, he was working at Leslie Welding in Fort Worth, a Lawrence Orloff went to visit Marina Oswald with George DeMohrenschildt. Now, there was an Alexander Orloff who worked with the Central Intelligence Agency, and there was another Orloff that worked with Henry Ford, helping to publish the Protocols of Elders of Zion, this important document that was given to the Nazis in Western Europe to say that the Jews were trying to take over the world. Dearborn, Michigan, and Detroit, Michigan were centers of some of the worst anti-Semitism and fascism coming out of this country. And it's interesting because the Warren Commission, of course, never checked out if the George DeMohrenschildt, Lawrence Orloff connections knew Ford at all or were related to the Orloff that was up at the Ford Motor Company. But the car of John Kennedy is up there, and of course we hear on the program this hearing is coming to you from the Ford Foundation, and I wonder, it's nice that they're putting that on, but I just assume they put a little money into shipping the car back to Washington where it can be ripped out again and examined. There also is the conclusion by Robert Blakey's testimony, John Connally's testimony, and Jeremiah Leary from the Washington Star continuously that John Kennedy was the suggestion that he was responsible for his own death. They kept making snide remarks such as John Kennedy had said anybody who comes to a tall building with a scope could kill you, you couldn't be protected. Well, that's not true. A man with a scope in a tall building in Miami was about to kill John Kennedy, and somebody reported it and taped it, and it was stopped. John Kennedy's under the assumption that if you have no Secret Service work, of course they can do it, but he should think that with foreign dignitaries getting people in tall buildings and in windows and covering windows from the streets looking at them to see if anybody was there who would be shooting, I'm sure that when he made the remark, he meant if you didn't have protection. But they kept repeating that first day the fact that, well, we never could protect a president if an individual wants to kill him. Now, they never say if there's a conspiracy and they want to kill him. As a matter of fact, Jeremiah Leary made a remark that he said even that little girl or kind of a thing, aspersion on Squeaky Fromm, if she could shoot a gun better, she would have got Gerald Ford. The question isn't whether or not Squeaky could pull a gun fast enough. The question is how did a member of the Manson family, dressed like Red Riding Hood with a red hood and those tennis shoes, freaky looking to begin with, get that close to the President of the United States when every other person has areas cordoned off? When Gerald Ford comes here to play golf, you can't get a car to go down the freeway for miles. Every access to Pebble Beach is closed off, and it's just impossible to get within 2 or 3 feet of Gerald Ford, much less to be one of the original members of the Manson family. And then John and Mrs. Connally kept saying over and over and reiterating that it was only because Kennedy wanted to come to Texas that they let him, that he was really a nuisance and he wasn't popular and he wasn't really wanted there, his position, I guess, on civil rights and so forth, and he kept pressuring it. So they finally said, the commission said, was there a time where you had to give in to his request to be there? That Kennedy just insisted that he's coming to Texas. So reluctantly, John Connally said, well, I'll do the best I can and give you these parties, and they make John Kennedy responsible for his own death instead of going into the loss and testimony on the terrible Secret Service protection that John Kennedy had at the time of his death. They make him seem to be responsible for it, and this is the work of Robert Blakey's commission and all the members. On the other side of this tape, I'm going to go into Robert Groden's testimony because I was very impressed with it. The evidence and pictures and documents that Robert Groden presented are the foot in the door that will keep the question of the assassinations going for at least another 20 years, and the fact that he presented it gets us started on a new era of public exposure. Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 353, September the 8th, 1978. Before I get into the Robert Groden testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations that took place on Wednesday, September the 6th, I do want to mention a couple of follow-ups to my tape on James Earl Ray real quickly that I didn't include last week, because I mentioned on the printed sheet that you got and on the tape that James Earl Ray talked about a date in 1964 where he was in contact with the late Clyde Watts of Oklahoma regarding a name that he had, Randolph Irving Rosen. And nobody on the committee asked about the date in 1964, and his attorney, Mark Lane, didn't say anything about it. But going back to my earlier Martin Luther King articles, I found a United Press story, San Francisco Chronicle. This is April the 18th, 1968, 2 weeks after Martin Luther King was killed. And the headline on the article, strangely enough, said, FBI, quotes, there's a plot in the King assassination. They went on to say that Eric Gold and at least one other person they thought alleged to be his brother were involved in this assassination, and later articles showed that they located Jerry Ray, the brother of this alleged Eric Starvo Galt, but they never charged him. Many articles came out after Martin Luther King was killed saying that the brother of Eric Starvo Galt was a co-conspirator, but Jerry Ray was never arrested or charged as a conspirator. But the article went on to say that Eric Starvo Galt was in New Orleans in 1964 and in 1965, and those are the dates that General Clyde Watts and General Walker were in New Orleans and in the South, and they were organizing, fighting the desegregation in the South when, at the time that Robert Kennedy picked up General Walker and had argued with their civil rights policies. James Earl Ray, according to the UPI story, if that was Eric Starvo Galt, wasn't even in jail. This particular Eric Starvo Galt is in New Orleans in 1964 and 65, and he's dancing in Birmingham in 1967, and he's in Long Beach in 1967, and in February, again, he's back in Long Beach in 68 before he comes back east in March for becoming involved in some way in the killing of Martin Luther King. But the date 64 is important because not only was he mentioning as late as 1978 about that date, but the man whose identity he took on was out and was in New Orleans at the identical time that this Eric Starvo Galt, James Earl Ray, was supposed to be in the Missouri Penitentiary. I don't know what to make of all that, but I do want to pass it on because not only was he in New Orleans many times making these telephone calls and having contacts there, but I have another article from April the 17th, a day before that, 1968, where Sheriff Mel Bailey said that he thought there was a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King that the pump rifle wouldn't have a spent shell on the bathroom floor. You'd have to pull back on the pump. And that discarded outside the rooming house was not only the Remington 30.06, but it was in a Browning automatic rifle packing box. And the Sheriff Bailey suggested that 2 rifles could be used, which this is what James Earl Ray was trying to say. Another rifle could kill Martin Luther King, and his could be put there to make a patsy out of him. And the sheriff was saying that a expended shell found in the bathroom could match the Remington, but it could be shot at an earlier date and planted to match the Remington. And I think that is interesting because that's what the whole single bullet theory is about. Were other shells and bullets shot at John, not just shells, the bullets at John Connally and John Kennedy, and was this bullet, it wasn't brought out before the hearings today, was it planted on a stretcher to link this to the weapon that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly shot? That was in 1963, and in 1968, Sheriff Mill Bailey is asking that question about planting evidence against this James Earl Ray, Eric Starvo Galt. At one point in the hearings, they were trying to pressure James Earl Ray to think of somebody who could confirm that he had contacts with another party, and he said, well, I gave telephone numbers out. Why didn't you ever check those out? And the House Select Committee sit like a bunch of eunuchs and with no motion, no expression, and no answers. But December 28th, 1974, there was an Associated Press article that James Earl Ray gave some telephone numbers to an attorney from Nashville, the name of Z.T. Osborne. That's interesting because Albert Osborne from Tennessee was the agent from the Pentagon from the Defense Industry Security Command with Lee Harvey Oswald. And this Osborne, an attorney who has since died, another witness not available, had 2 phone numbers that James Earl Ray gave him. And these were checked out in 1974, and Mr. Osborne, before he passed away, or maybe he passed away because of it, reported that one number that James Earl Ray had at Baton Rouge was the parish county, the official under the influence of the Teamsters Union official in Baton Rouge. It had to do with the Teamsters organization in Baton Rouge. And the second phone number had to do in the New Orleans area with an agent from the Middle East, an organization that was concerned with Martin Luther King's getting into politics and support of the Palestinian Arab cause. So there were Middle Eastern agents here, and that would confirm Robert Byron Watson's story, or it's worth going into, that the people who killed Martin Luther King were involved with the Middle East, Mr. Habash and Hadid, and that they were active with the Palestinian groups, and also the research of David Ferry down at Baton Rouge with Carlos Marcello, and that was supposed to be an escape route for Lee Harvey Oswald through Baton Rouge. That was an area where Joe Cooper, the writer for the Tatler, National Tatler, was exposing the links to the Kennedy assassination at Baton Rouge, and he was blown up and murdered, and the newspaper folded, and that was the end of the expose of the Baton Rouge organization, the Teamsters Organized Crime Group. So I think it's interesting that James Earl Ray was visiting a party, an engineer in the International Trade Mart where Clay Shaw had worked. He had phone number in Baton Rouge, where these other connections linked to the Kennedy assassination, and also the Middle Eastern agents in the New Orleans area. After John and Nellie Connally testified before the House Select Committee, Robert Groden was allowed to testify on the photographic evidence of conspiracy, and he seemed to suggest that he was representing all the researchers, or all the critics, he called them the critics, and the House Select Committee, I think, let him give his testimony, and then they figured, we'll let the whole thing drop, and he gave areas that should be gone into, and at least, again, they will be sold, bound by the government printing office. You can buy his testimony. It was great. Then you can check the further hearings of the House Select Committee and their past work, and you'll see the areas that they didn't get into. He went into the time sequence of the Abraham Zapruder film and tried to explain to that dense, thick committee back in Washington, D.C., that Oswald couldn't get off more than 3 shots in 6.5 seconds. even if Mrs. Connally was right that she heard a first shot that went in John Kennedy's back and through the throat, and a second that hit John Connally, and a third that hit John Kennedy in the head, there is still a man named Mr. Teague who was hit by a bullet that hit the curb and ricocheted. That would make 4, and that would make a conspiracy. And he showed the Abraham Zapruder film in the sequence of the frames. The next thing he talked about was the flight path of the bullet and the impossibility of the course of direction, which the next day Cyril Wecht went into extensively in the trajectory. He showed how 2 shots came so close to John Connally and John Kennedy and yet appeared to be coming from different bullets, that it would suggest a crossfire because Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't pull a bolt-action rifle that quickly to take those shots so close together. He showed the fatal headshot of John Kennedy going backwards, which the 9 doctors and panelists the following day could not explain and hardly tried to explain. They passed things off as if it's a matter of opinion, and Cyril Wecht kept saying no. With ballistics and scientific evidence, it isn't a matter of opinion. When you can put a thing to a scientific test, the test should be made. He showed volume 18 of the Warren Commission hearings. This is Robert Groden, pages 70 to 71, where the Warren report was printed. The frames of the Abraham Zapruder film were printed backwards so that it looked as if the fatal headshot went forward, and he mentioned that a critic of the Warren report had noticed this. He gives no credit to anybody who's done all this work, even though he came in fairly late in the game. He doesn't talk about the flight path and Robert Cutler, and he doesn't talk about the person who first noticed the reversal of the frames. But the main thing is that he gave a very good presentation. He showed a picture of Dealey Plaza, a blow-up of the window, several people's pictures, one by Robert Hughes and Tom Brewer, and one Agent Powell of Army Intelligence, and these were up at the window at the time of the assassination, and none showed the body of Lee Harvey Oswald in the window. He showed the Algin photo of the Dow Tex building, which is directly behind the car. As John Kennedy had turned the corner and was going down the street, the Dow Tex was in back, and he showed the photograph of a man on the fire escape with what looked like a rifle coming out of the Dow Tex building. Now, he stressed about a man named Mr. Miltier. I'll describe him to you in a minute. And he felt that the blow-up of this picture looked like Mr. Miltier and suggested that Miltier could have been at Dealey Plaza and that the commission should look into this. Mr. Miltier is a man who made a tape recording with the Miami Police Department 2 weeks before John Kennedy was killed, and he said that a high-powered rifle was going to be used to kill John Kennedy, and that it would be assembled and brought into a building, and then somebody else would shoot this rifle, another rifle, and there would be a patsy who would take the blame for the murder. And this tape recording was given to the Warren Commission. They were told, while they did their work, that there was a patsy, that somebody was going to be set up, and when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, he said, "I am a patsy," and then when he saw the pictures, he said, "That's not my body. There's a head attached, but it's not my body." And then Lee Harvey Oswald was shot in the jail, and they knew that there was a plan. The Warren Commission knew there was a plan to kill John Kennedy in Miami 2 weeks earlier. They not only didn't go into that, but when Abraham Bolden, the Secret Service agent, told them there was a plan to kill John Kennedy 3 weeks earlier in Chicago, and it involved a man named Oswald, they put Bolden in a prison mental hospital for 6-7 years, the way they put away Martha Mitchell and the way they put away Grace Stevens, if they know too much, or Walter Scott. When we talk about human rights and the Soviet Union, I think it's about time to compile a letter and put a full-page ad in some newspaper and let Jimmy Carter know what we do with people here that are political prisoners. But he did talk about Miltier because it appeared that that was Miltier's face in the Dow Tex building, and he didn't mention in his presentation that Eugene Brading of organized crime was arrested and then released in the Dow Tex building, that he had been using a false name and was out on parole. But he did get a lot. I don't want to criticize Groden's testimony because it was really good. He showed Mary Mormon pictures of a stockade fence behind the grassy knoll area, and a parking lot, and there's a concrete wall. And from the pictures that Mary Moorman took, you can see somebody identified there, a person. And after the assassination, that party got up and fled towards the railroad tracks. The pictures of Moorman were supported, he showed, by pictures of Emmett Hudson, who was a witness, and the Philip Willis pictures that support the Moorman pictures, that there is a figure there. He showed, Grodin showed the Zapruder film, the site when Abraham Zapruder was taking the scenes of John Kennedy. He had, through the view of his camera, you could also see that man on the cement wall, what appears to be a man in a firing position, and he showed that. Robert Grodin showed photographic evidence of areas of conspiracy that the new House Select Committee, or the old one that's ready to go out of business, should have investigated. He showed pictures of the umbrella man with his umbrella, and he turned it around counterclockwise when John Kennedy was passing. For those of you that don't take Penn Jones' newsletter, you should. The Continuing Inquiry. His latest issue has an article on how he found the umbrella man in Dallas, Texas, and he's never been interviewed before, but he's willing to go before the House Select Committee. He's been identified now as L. Stephen Witt, and Penn has this information in his newsletter, and I'll give you his address again in case you don't have it and want to start subscribing. He has a monthly newsletter that is very valuable. He went to see the man, and the implication of, or suggestion he had, I don't know whether he told Penn, I believe he told Penn that Joe Kennedy had appeased the Nazis during World War II, just prior to it, and the umbrella was a symbol of appeasement with Chamberlain and giving in to Hitler, and that John Kennedy had appeased the Castro forces and the communists, and the umbrella was a symbol of appeasement. Whether or not it was a weapon also, we don't know, but this man will be testifying before the House Select Committee. Bob Cutler wrote a book on the bullet direction, the trajectory, Bullet 399. He wrote a book called The Umbrella Man, and I think that some of these witnesses should have given credit to these other critics, because the people watching national television should be aware of how many people are doing this work. But he did go into the story of Joseph Miltier and the fact that it appeared that he was not only taping the plans to kill John Kennedy 2 weeks earlier, but that he was, in fact, in Dealey Plaza the time of the assassination. He then presented the committee the famous tramp photos. He didn't say whether or not one of them was E. Howard Hunt or Frank Sturgis. He said these are presented by members of the critical community, the researchers, and the fact that the police took these men away and never fingerprinted or took their names should be investigated, and the fact that they were picked over at the railroad yard, which is where this man was seen fleeing, who allegedly was on that concrete wall. Somebody should account for this fact. And he pointed out that one man carrying or accompanying the tramps away is Fredley Crisman. He's an extreme right-wing man. He lived in the Seattle area, and he was down in the South a lot, and he's dead. Grodin mentioned that Crisman and Miltier were both dead. There may be the possibility that because so many people are dead, they will say, inasmuch as Mr. Miltier is dead and Mr. Crisman is dead and these various other people, we will never know. There are still many people alive that we could call as witnesses, but Miltier and Crisman are no longer with us. He showed the James Algen photographs in front of the Texas School Book Depository. There's a picture of a man with a sweater, white shirt open, and it very much resembles Lee Harvey Oswald. And when the Warren Commission had these pictures, they interviewed a man named Billy Lovelady and said it was Billy Lovelady, but he had a dark shirt, dressed more like an FBI man, and his clothing didn't resemble the man in the doorway. And of course, if Lee Harvey Oswald watched the assassination from the street, he couldn't be upstairs on the 6th floor. I personally think that this is one of the poorest pictures to submit as evidence, because the House Select Committee will take the weakest points and build them up the most. If Lee Harvey Oswald were watching the motorcade and he were arrested, he was in the first floor having a Coke, he could have said, I saw the motorcade, and recounted what took place and so forth. And if he saw the killing, he would still be out on the street, instead of running in for a Coke. So if he was on the street, he had to cover an alibi. And I think that, I don't know Billy Lovelady or anything about him, but there were many people in that area that resembled Lee Harvey Oswald, some that impersonated him up to the time of the assassination, and that could have been one of them standing in the door. He showed the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle at Neely Street and illustrated the differences in the shadows under the nose and the difference between the shadow directly, the sun directly over the head that would make the square triangle over the nose, and then the sun facing the rifle, the long shadows in back of the rifle at a different time of day. Now the things that Robert Groden presented that I'm recounting for you are not new for old researchers. It's not new material, but what is new is that nationwide on national television in at least 60 or 80 cities in the United States, if not more, it went out nationally to all cable TV. This was new for many people. And somebody who works closely with me, believe it or not, had never seen the tramp photographs. And many people had never seen the Abraham Zapruder film as close as it was. And this is a big selling point about the direction of the head. So the discrepancies of the shadows on the rifle that came out, say, to early researchers, certainly was not known to many people. And this is a whole new generation of people growing up who weren't aware of the discrepancies in the shadows. And he also showed the discrepancy of the rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald was showing. And he held the pictures, and he had a diagram. There were photographs of 4 rifles in this presentation, and one was a rifle that was ordered from Klein's gun store in Chicago that was supposed to be where Lee Harvey Oswald ordered this particular rifle, and one is the rifle that's in the National Archives that was supposed to be the murder weapon. And he shows the rifle that was photographed, the length of the rifle in proportion to the body of the picture at Neely Street in Texas, where Lee Harvey Oswald lived, and shows that there is 3 to 4 inches size difference in these rifles. And when you line them up, there's discrepancies, and they don't fit. If you hold them in the middle together, the ends don't lap over. They should all be the same rifle, and they were far from the same rifle. He also showed the different chins close up. The head that Lee Harvey Oswald said was his, superimposed on a body that wasn't his. Fred Newcomb, very fine researcher in Santa Monica, did this work. He did it, and a few people got on the bandwagon and took it and never gave him credit. I feel really badly about that. I just think it's terrible that the community of critics cannot work and help each other. We all help each other, but then somebody takes the information and just uses it. And Fred Newcomb was the one who did all this magnificent work, and you see a Lee Harvey Oswald with a pointed chin. It's quite clear. And then the other head is a straight chin, and one has a thin neck with a pointy chin, and one has a fat neck and a straight chin. He showed a picture of a rifle that didn't have enough identifying marks in it to conclude it was the one found in the Texas School Book Depository. And he went into the discrepancies of the various rifles. One, the first story, that it was a German Mauser, an Italian Carcano, and he showed the differences of the ends of the barrel and the lengths and the trigger part itself, and how when they lined up they didn't look like the same rifle at all. And of course there was the controversy of the Oswald pictures, and he had a diagram broken down in inches of Lee Harvey Oswald in the Marines. He was 5'11", and then they show this picture of him with inches and so forth, and then the autopsy story of Lee Harvey Oswald, he was 5'9". Now what he's saying here, he's bringing out many points. They also had pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union and a different size and height than the one that was in the service or the one that was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Now that is a lot of information to bring to national television into the American home on any one day. What happens is that the media completely ignores it. I don't know in your hometown how you covered it or how it was covered, but I have our newspaper here, and this is the way they covered yesterday's testimony. They said, John F. Kennedy death scene, Connally's tell of silence and horror in assassination car. And this is George Lardner, Jr. from the Washington Post, and the article is 2 full columns down a page, and it's all about John Connally. Now, the Connallys testified in the morning and said hardly anything except that they reiterated that he said there were 2 shots, she said 3. But then Robert Groden comes on with all this information in the afternoon, and there wasn't one article in our newspaper or in the Washington Post about Robert Groden. Groden went on to tell the committee that there were things that he was presenting that he didn't necessarily go with. In some ways, he was very advanced in bringing up all this material, and others, he said there were certain things of this evidence that maybe he agreed with 1% and some of it 90%, but he said he will tell the committee what he doesn't agree with, and of course they'll take his testimony and give no credence to some of this. I'm sure that he doesn't go along with the A.J. Weberman allegations that Howard Hunt was in Dallas or that Frank Sturgis was in Dallas, Texas. I understand that A.J. Weberman, who has been pushing the tramp photos and saying that the White House plumbers were in Dealey Plaza, has obtained a document written by James Angleton, a CIA document that's been declassified, that states, how were we going to be able to explain that E. Howard Hunt was in Dallas the day of the assassination? Now, that doesn't mean he was photographed with Frank Sturgis, but E. Howard Hunt will be a witness before the House Select Committee, and I wonder if he'll be asked that question, or if he'll be spared the embarrassment, or he will continue to perjure himself and lie about that particular event. He seems to be covered so far that he was in Washington, but a new document has come out suggesting that he wasn't. But the important thing about the Groden testimony on national television, and I still am quite a state of shock, I can't believe it, is that if there are hard rifle discrepancies, if the shape of the rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly ordered from the Klein's gun shop in Chicago is different than the rifle that was found behind the boxes at the Texas School Book Depository building, that opens up a whole line of inquiry that must be accounted for. I've broken the chain of command of how these things happen, but there is no appointed body in Washington and no group of researchers outside of myself that has addressed these questions and then looked for the answers to them. Also, that Oswald double story, if Oswald was 5'11" in the Marines and he was 5'9" at the cemetery, I think that I have spent a lot of time answering those questions, and that's why I bring up those meetings of the Warren Commission when Earl Warren wanted the body of Lee Harvey Oswald cremated before the Warren Commission began their work. When I went through the 26 volumes, I found 39 incidences of where one Lee Harvey Oswald was at a location when another man using that name was at another place. And I think that's important because the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had ordered the cremation of physical evidence, the body of a man that was killed in a police department by Jack Ruby, and maybe the answer to the two sizes would have to do with why Earl Warren ordered the cremation of the body. And one member of the Warren Commission who's going to be testifying before the House Select Committee is Gerald Ford, and it would be very nice if Robert Blakey and the committee asked him about the meeting and the decisions to cremate the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. The name of Ramsey Clark comes up in terms of evidence that was missing at the National Archives, the brains of John Kennedy, and also it comes up in terms of the Martin Luther King assassination because Ramsey Clark was the Attorney General. It was Ramsey Clark who said as soon as Martin Luther King was killed as the Attorney General, in quotes, it was a one-man job, there's no evidence of a conspiracy. That was on Friday. He said that right after Martin Luther King was killed. On Saturday, he said to the press, an arrest is near, the murder solution is close, and there's no sign that the Klan was involved in killing Martin Luther King. On Sunday, he was on Meet the Press saying that he had the assassin on the run, and they asked him at the time, you don't have a suspect, how could you have an assassin on the run? And he said that they were after this assassin, and there was absolutely no conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King. And even when the FBI had articles 2 weeks later saying there was a conspiracy because there were 2 or more people working with this Eric Starvo-Gault, who turned out to be James Earl Ray, Ramsey Clark said no. But I think it's important to know that in 1966, Ramsey Clark, as the Attorney General, formed what is known as the Interdivisional Information Unit. That's the IDIU. And it was in response to civil rights agitations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And the Attorney General wanted an intelligence operation that would, in quotes, monitor potential troublemakers and civil disturbances. So the Attorney General, Ramsey Clark, began to gather information from his IDIU on organizations such as community relations services, poverty programs, neighborhood and legal services programs, labor departments, and used agents of IRS, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, the post office, the President's Commission on Civil Disorders. Now that's important because this IDIU got over 42,000 intelligence reports on civil disorders and campus disorders, and famous activists that were involved in this were Robert Abernathy, Cesar Chavez, Coretta King, Bosley Crowther, and others, and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So I think it's interesting that the IDIU was formed by Attorney General Ramsey Clark to watch Martin Luther King, and then as soon as Martin Luther King was murdered, as the Attorney General, without any evidence at all, he said constantly the Martin Luther King murder points to a single actor. He referred to the suspect as an actor. Maybe he was under mind control and brainwashed, and he refers to him as that, and says that he's just a man on the run. As I say, the FBI called it a conspiracy. So the very person that Ramsey Clark was watching and harassing, and the FBI was telling that he should commit suicide, probably do them the favor, and so they wouldn't have to kill him, this very Ramsey Clark, very person who formed this intelligence group against people using their civil rights, was the man who was putting down the idea of a conspiracy so strongly. And I think the Attorney General and the Justice Department, the FBI, have certainly showed their hands in these investigations, and the way, if they didn't plan these assassinations, they show their assistance in the way they're covered up. Now, next week we'll do our tape, as I promised, on Evel Younger, and then we'll get back to the House Select Committee. And as I said before, on the other side, if you have any questions, World Watchers, just pick up the phone and call me, and I'll answer them. If you have any suggestions or ideas on the hearings, give me a ring or write to me, and I'll send you information either on a tape or on the telephone. In the meantime, if you can, watch the hearings because they're very excellent. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel, and I'll see you next week.